Hello and welcome to today's EHS Today webinar, Navigating Evolving PFAS Regulations. Are your products and operations at risk? Sponsored by BSI Group. I'm Nicole Stempak, Managing Editor of EHS Today and your moderator this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're listening. Before we get started, let me explain how you can participate in today's presentation. First, if at any time you are having audio difficulties or slides are not advancing, simply hit your F5 key to refresh your webcast console. If you are running pop-up blocking software, you will need to disable it to view this webinar. If you have any technical difficulties during today's session, please press the question mark help button in the upper right corner to receive assistance in solving common issues. This webinar technology allows you to resize the presentation by clicking the maximize icon in the upper right corner to enlarge the window. We welcome your questions during today's event. To submit them, simply type them into the Ask a Question window on the left side of your screen and then hit the Submit button. We'll be answering as many questions as possible during the Q&A session that will follow the main presentation, but please feel free to send those in at any time and we'll add them to the queue. Please also be aware that today's session is being recorded and will be available in the EHS Today, on the EHS Today website within the next day for you to review. You'll be notified by email when the archive is available. And when the webinar ends, we ask that you please take a moment to complete the feedback form that will appear on your screen. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Daniel Smith is Global Practice Director of Environmental at BSI Consulting. With over 30 years of experience in the EHS industry, Daniel specializes in complex risk management program development and implementation, including federal and state Superfund, brownfield and voluntary cleanup programs, and business and property transactions focusing on environmental issues. Daniel also has extensive regulatory negotiation and coordination experience, including litigation support and expert witness experience related to contaminant assessment, migration, remediation, and resolution of environmental concerns. For more information on Daniel, please check out the Speaker Details tab on your event console. Welcome, Daniel, and without further ado, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. Hi, my name is Daniel Smith, as she mentioned here, and I am a practice director at BSI in the environmental sector here. And essentially that role gets me involved in a lot of different things. One of the things that we're going to talk about today, as far as emerging contaminants, are PFAS. And many of you on the call, I'm sure, have heard of PFAS. Some of you may have not, but they're one of the biggest pressing issues we're seeing in the environmental industry today. And what we're going to talk about today is to give you a little bit of a primer on what are PFAS, what are the regulatory concerns you need to be aware of, and what are some management strategies to minimize your risks related to those concerns. So the first thing I want to really get into here is what are PFAS and PFAS definitions. And it's really important to understand that as you get into the details of PFAS, there are actually just hundreds and hundreds of different definitions. There is actually a paper that was prepared by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development that is a 40-page paper solely around the definition of PFAS. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about a couple different definitions that you need to be aware of. Some are based on chemistry, others are more practical. And the reason why this is so important is because what you're going to find is that every regulation defines PFAS and applicability differently. So going to the next slide here. As far as the chemical definitions of PFAS go, I'm not going to expect everyone here to be a PhD in chemistry. That's not the goal. The important thing to remember is that it's going to be any chemical that has what they call a perfluorinated methyl group or a perfluorinated methylene group. And what that means essentially, it's got fluorine in it. And the fluorine, what it does is it has certain properties which make PFAS wonderfully beneficial in society, but it also causes these bonds, cause some problems as far as toxic effects, as well as potentially persistence in the environment. A more rigorous definition is found under certain regulatory programs. And the one I put here is under the TSCA program. And the reason I show this one is because for those of you who do know your chemistry, it gives you the chemical formula of what is a PFAS. And this one also comes into play because right now, as I'll get into later, the TSCA reporting is probably the most active regulation that's impacting a lot of businesses right now. So we've got the chemical definitions, but let's talk about things that are more important. Let's talk about the practical definition. What are PFAS? Basically, they're a category of synthetic chemicals that are best known for water-resistant and stain-resistant properties. And as a result of that, just immediately just think in your head, how many things do you interact with every day that have stain resistance or water resistance? And it'll immediately jump out to you that they have potential to be everywhere. And I think that's really why the focus on PFAS has been so critical. So the other thing to think about with PFAS, a lot of you have probably heard this term forever chemicals. I just want to point out that I think that's a bit of a misnomer. While there are certain chemicals and compounds within PFAS that could last forever or a very long time, you got to remember there's over 10,000, some people say 12, 16,000 different PFAS chemicals. And some subset of those may have those properties, but not all of them do. And as we'll get into a little bit later, there are certain PFAS chemicals and compounds out there that don't necessarily have to persist in the environment. So this is where it gets important to understand the definitions and what applies to certain regulations and to how you manage those PFAS risks. Similarly, there's one other thing too, is there's a lot of perceptions about health effects of PFAS. And it's also important when you think about PFAS, not to necessarily make generalizations on health impacts. While there are some PFAS that do have potentially adverse health impacts, not all PFAS do. Some PFAS they've studied, and they've shown what they call them as PFAS of low concern. And that's based upon both the limited ability of with health and safety impacts, as also it also has to do with their persistence in the environment maybe not being as bad. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is before we go forward, I want to advance this to a poll question. And our first poll question is going to really be gauged to see what does the audience think about the level of PFAS discussion going on. So if it's possible, if we can send that poll out to the audience. Make sure that's being done here. Let's say, okay, so basically we're asking, what do you think is the level of attention on PFAS? Is it too much, too little, not enough? And I think it's really important that we kind of go through this. And the reason I'm asking this question here is because, believe it or not, I do feel there's a right answer here. While it's an opinion question, there tends to be a right answer. And I'd like to see what the audience thinks. Why don't we give that another minute or so, and then we can talk about the results quickly before moving on with the presentation. Okay, we've gotten over 100 responses already, which is pretty good. So people, I'm going to give it just another 10 seconds. We'll send that to the audience, and then let's talk about the results a little bit. Okay, hopefully everyone can see those results on their screen right now. And it's pretty interesting. There's a little bit of every category. And one thing that's interesting, I think, is number 4 was the winner here, which was basically that we still don't understand the PFAS. And I do believe, personally, my opinion, that is the right answer. While we do understand certain elements of PFAS, there are a lot of things we're still learning, both with their health effects, their persistence in the environment, how we need to regulate them, the impact it'll have on society and businesses trying to comply. All these things go into the hype around PFAS. While it's interesting that we did have the second case was that there's not enough attention on PFAS. And I think that's interesting because there's been so much about this in my lifetime in this industry. Probably the only thing I've seen hyped as much of PFAS is probably would be asbestos. And a lot of people make the comparison to asbestos, but I don't necessarily think it's been overhyped, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of discussion that really leads to incorrect findings and incorrect results. So anyway, we will move forward on to the next part of it. And let's talk a little bit about common PFAS uses. So I think this is something that's a really important part of the presentation. First thing I just want to say, it's borderline impossible to list all places where PFAS may be present. But what I want to but there's a common things in there that to be aware of. We mentioned the stain and water resistant properties. So certain industries that would be more impacted than others, the apparel industry, for example. If you've had stain resistant clothing, water resistant clothing, that's a really big deal. And part of the reason it's so important to understand these different categories and how they're used is because the types of PFAS differ by category. Like, for example, one of the most common types of uses that people talk about is non-stick cookware. Well, that's an obvious one that people talk about all the time. From a regulatory and health impact perspective, believe it or not, it's probably one of the lesser important PFAS. The chemical that's involved in non-stick cookware is usually PTFE, or polytetrafluoroethylene, which is actually listed as one of the low concern PFAS chemicals. So despite that being the case example that everyone uses as a PFAS use and a product, it's actually one from a regulatory point of view that's relatively minor compared to some others. Other ones to be aware of is, for example, the firefighting foams. This is important because in some of these use cases, as we'll talk about later when you get into the risk management, there are certain chemical uses where they've got lots of potential replacement products for PFAS. They've got other uses of PFAS where the world and the industry is really struggling with how to replace the PFAS chemicals. So that's an important consideration as well as you look at the categories and how they're used. I'm sorry, next slide here. Bear with me, I apologize. We talked about the different compounds. So I'm not going to get into the specific chemistry, but the point of this slide is to show there's three main categories of types of PFAS. The first one to be aware of, and I think probably the most important from a regulatory perspective, is perfluoroalkyl acids. And of those, there's two specific ones that are mentioned most often in regulatory programs. The first is PFOA, and the second is PFOS. The reason these are the most prevalent ones that people talk about is because they're known to have some of the more toxic potential impacts. They're also known to be less treatable and less degradable within the environment. So that unique combination of both being persistent as well as potentially having health effects makes them probably the ones that have been studied the most, and also the wave of regulations that have come out. It's probably the ones that have really dominated that first wave of regulations. Okay, the second ones that are important more because of what we still don't know about them are the polyfluoroalkyl substances. The fire foams are pretty widespread and people know the issues with fire foams. But one of the challenges we're running with this category of PFAS that we keep seeing is that it's showing up in treatment plant effluent sampling. It's showing up in landfill leachate. And in many cases, the source of how it's getting there isn't really obvious. So I think in the second category of the polyfluoroalkyl substances, the real issue of concern is that just exactly how's it getting there? And then what do we do about it? And the third category, which we're not going to talk too much about today, are the polymer PFAS. This case, the most obvious one I mentioned earlier is PTFE, and the trade name that a lot of you know it by is Teflon. This one, from a regulatory perspective, is kind of trailing some of the others because of some of the lack of concerns or the fact they've rated it as a low concern PFAS. So we're not going to spend too much time talking on that. A quick little primer of PFAS and why it's important to understand this will become apparent when you see how everything has been compressed. PFAS started off as the wonder chemicals. When they first came out and were being synthesized, the widespread use just exploded in the 50s, 60s, 70s, because they were finding there were so many beneficial uses of PFAS. Then what happened in the 70s and 80s, it's kind of, I call it the transition period. This is where the great benefits were still known, but they were starting to identify some potential concerns with the chemistry. And then in this transition period, from the 80s to about 2000, the industry really focused on understanding the chemicals, obtaining raw data, doing testing, and trying to get a better handle on just how strictly these needed to be regulated and managed. Then we get to the 2000s, and this is the first time where we've kind of shifted. Okay, now PFAS, they're not necessarily good. These could potentially be bad. And as a group, we started looking at, okay, these need to be phased out. They need to be restricted. And even with the 2000s starting that, it really wasn't until the 2010s when the regulations really started to first come in And more importantly, it really wasn't until only the last 3 to 4 years that you've gotten binding, enforceable type regulations that are really driving the industry. So at this point, what I'd like to do is let's talk a little bit about some of these regulations. Okay, we're going to go into an overview. This is not intended to cover all regulatory programs. That would be a 5-day seminar. But what we do want to talk about is what are some of those key ones that right now are really coming into play, and what are those key ones that have the most likely impact on your operations? So the first PFAS regulations, they really started back in the 2010s, as we mentioned. And the EU actually started with a lot of driving the PFAS with some of the early regulations. And then basically in 2016 is when the US started getting more involved. And a lot of this started initially at the state level. So certain states were looking at driving PFAS regulations. And the biggest things that you need to be aware of with these early regulations is that they really weren't readily accepted. In many cases, there were challenges, and in some cases, those challenges were legal challenges. So a lot of the regulations that were initially proposed never really came into fruition because of the challenges and the complexities, where in some cases, even the regulators weren't really ready to enforce their own regulations. So as a result, what you saw was kind of about a 5-year hiatus on some of the regulations. While they still came out, there really weren't too many impacts. In many cases, even where there were regulatory, quote unquote, requirements, they were really voluntary. I think the most common thing you saw between 2015 and 2020 was different states asking people who were already in existing regulatory programs to consider, excuse me, I'm sorry, just got word that some people may have a little trouble with the microphone, so I'm trying to adjust that. So basically what happened, I'm sorry, in around 2015 to 2020 is that a lot of regulatory agencies were basically asking for voluntary information in monitoring programs or different operations. And every company decided to respond differently to that. In some cases, companies were very aggressive in saying, no, we're not providing it. Other companies provide the information with caveats and everything in between. So this is when the regulatory program really started to shift. So what I want to talk about next is with the change in what I'm calling the regulatory explosion. And really where this has come into play is that in the last 3 to 4 years, there have been more regulatory regulations coming out on PFAS than almost every other environmental program. And there are really 4 to be aware of as the main 4 that are currently driving business. The first one that I'm going to talk about a little bit here is the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. And for those of you who may not know, they have some pretty significant reporting regulations that are in effect now with deadlines that are actually been published. Second thing is going to be under Circular, the program. They've actually included PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances. And this has the potential to drive a lot of site investigation and cleanup work, as well as mandatory release reporting. Second, other one I want to talk about here is basically the EPCR program and TRI reporting. TRI reporting has been around for a while, and even some of the PFAS have been phased in since 2020, but they've made some recent changes, which I'll get into, which are going to really exponentially increase the reporting obligations related to PFAS. And the last one we're going to talk about in a little bit of detail here is the Clean Water Act regulations. And basically the main thing that to be aware of here is under the Safe Drinking Water Act, they basically have for the first time established enforceable maximum contaminant levels for drinking water. And while some of those initial impacts may be more focused on the water supply industry, that's usually the precursor to really drive other regulations, which we'll talk about. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the TSCA reporting. Basically, what I'm going to do is we're not going to be able to get into all the nuance of these regulations today. So what I'd like to do is just give you a quick overview. And the who, what, where, when, how type model works good for a brief webinar such as this to give you an overview. So who has to consider the TSCA reporting regulations? It's basically going to be any entity that manufactured PFAS in any year since 2011. And for those of you who are used to regulatory compliance, this is really a big differentiator from a lot of regulations. It's very rare that regulations will retroactively go back and ask for annual reporting data. And immediately, what I think most people are going to be talking about here is going to be, well, how do I do that? I don't have that data. And that is going to be a real complicating factor for those who do have to apply. The other thing to be aware of here too is that there are a lot, usually regulations have a ton of exemptions so that it only applies to very small subsets of the population or subsets of an industry. The TSCA reporting rule eliminated a lot of the more standard type of exemptions for certain de minimis concentrations or for things like articles is the biggest one. An article is something that has like a definitive shape, and that shape affects its use and purpose. And what happens in most cases, like a desk would be an article. A lot of these reporting regulations have always exempted reporting articles because think about how many people have desks that may have a paint coating or something like that that could be subject to reporting. Well, the TSCA rule is one of the few that did not allow that article exemption. So what it's done is opened up the level of reporting to just an enormous amount of industries and companies and people that will never have to report in the past. Now, as far as timing goes on this, the type of reporting, what you have to report, basically what you have to do is report the mass of PFAS in your organization. And that comes both from imported, from external sources, as well as things you manufacture and generate yourself. So it's very important to understand that it's a lot of data. And what you'll see is that most companies are not prepared to handle it. What's interesting, I thought, was that initially the reporting for TSCA was scheduled to happen in 2025. And the regulators themselves basically are acknowledging they're not ready to handle the influx of data coming in. So the one big takeaway from this slide, I think that's important, is yes, they've extended things out to 2026, but as you start getting into the details, you're going to learn that basically don't wait. There's a lot of effort that's going to go into this. So let's talk a little bit about the requirements here. Important things to be aware of is while it's focusing on manufacturers, a lot of the information the manufacturers are going to need to report is actually going to have to come from their suppliers and their supply chain. So immediately, it's not only going to involve the manufacturers, it's also going to involve all those entities who supply things to the manufacturers. So for any of you who have been involved in the supply chain business, you can know every tier you go out on the supply chain, things exponentially increase. So one of the big challenges with this reporting under TSCA is to get the information you need, but at the same time, not spend so much time and effort getting it that it could cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars to get information for a regular reporting obligation. So we'll talk about this a little more in the risk management part of the presentation, but one of the challenges that we always advise our customers on is that you really need to think about your own risk tolerance to determine what is reasonably ascertainable for the data to report. Because while you could go down a rabbit hole of constantly, okay, here's my first tier supplier, well, where did they get their materials from? And then where did they get their materials from? And eventually it just becomes overwhelming with both the cost, the time, and even the accuracy of the data. So I think it's very important to understand your management systems, your inventory systems, and even if you're not ready to dive all in on the PFAS reporting, one recommendation I have is take a look at your systems you have that track your chemical usage, your inventories, your composition of chemicals, and get that data scrubbed and get it organized. And also look at your supply chain. Understand that your suppliers are going to have to help with this. So as a result of that, we're really recommending and advocating that people start early with the TSCA reporting. One other thing I just want to mention quickly about TSCA is that I'm focusing this on a lot of US-based regulations. Other countries also have their own regulatory programs. For example, in Canada, they have a PFAS reporting regulation that is active right now, and the reporting is the end of January 2025. So if you haven't started that, you're already too late to meet the reporting obligations. Okay. Next thing we want to talk about in reporting, this is another rule based around reporting. And what you're going to find here is there's kind of a trend. The first PFAS regulations coming out are all based upon around data gathering. Where is it? How widespread is it? And it's basically factual data that they're trying to get. This data in turn will drive some of the other regulations. So as far as TRI PFAS reporting, a couple things to be aware of. This is, again, a pretty widespread potential applicability. It's driven by NAICS codes. And depending upon what your code is, it goes by certain thresholds of what you manufacture, process, or otherwise use. So in this case, they had some PFAS that were coming in as early as 2020, but the biggest change that's recent that impacts the level of people who have to report and how much data they have to obtain, they're designating PFAS as chemical of special concern. And under that designation, the real important impacts of that is that it eliminates de minimis exemptions. So basically, a lot of chemicals where you use them in smaller quantities or they were in small concentrations in mixtures used to be able to exempt some of that reporting. Well, they've made that much more challenging now, okay? In addition, they're also considering adding additional rules that would add 15 categories of PFAS, so you would have categorical reporting as well. So when you look at this, one thing that's very important to be aware of is just, even if you never had to report before, the new PFAS triggers could actually make you have to report going forward. So one thing, just to give you a feel of the gravity of that statement about who this impacts, US EPA alone, as part of their own development of rules and regulatory changes, one of the things they have to do is they need to look at the impact on those that may have to comply with the new regulation. EPA's own estimates were that as many as 10,000 new reporters may have to report under TRI just because of the PFAS requirement. So what they've done is they've taken out other drivers for additional reporting, just looked at just the new PFAS rules, and those alone, they're saying as many as 10,000 new reporters are expected. So the takeaway from the TRI reporting is basically that you probably are going to have to take a step back, relook at your organization, and don't just assume that because we didn't have to report before, we don't have to report now, because there may be triggers for brand new reporting obligations. And in some cases, the time and effort into doing that reporting can be very complicated or costly. Next category, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Those are the two primary reporting regulations that have come out recently and are really driving the industry right now. The next big change, and some of you may have been reading about this, is the water quality regulation changes. Basically, what it comes down to is that for the first time, they have enforceable maximum contaminant levels for drinking water. And where this is so important is that basically you now have a regulatory criteria for water quality that is being provided. The initial impact of this is going to be felt primarily from the drinking water suppliers. They have a phase-in program to do additional monitoring for PFAS that's coming into their system and being sent out to their customers. But then once that initial monitoring is done, they have enforceable PFAS MCLs by 2029. And where this comes into play is that, let's say they find PFAS within their water supply, they are going to be obligated to either take those wells offline or come up with treatment systems to eliminate the PFAS to meet the MCL. And the treatment options for PFAS, because of their chemical structure, tend to be a little more costly and not as efficient or effective as some of the more common treatment mechanisms. So as a result, this has a lot of very long-range implications. There's going to be a lot more cost to people. It could even impact cost of water down the road because of how widespread it's expected to be. And then you've also got the fact that there are going to be continuing monitoring programs. And then what happens if you've got monitoring data showing PFAS in drinking water supplies? That could lead to litigation. It could lead towards a lot of other factors. So what are the numbers here? A couple things to be aware of. There are 4 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS. And notice I did say trillion. For those of you who don't do a lot of this, normally regulations and chemical concentrations, you're generally talking parts per billion, parts per million. Parts per trillion is at a whole different level of detail, and just the fact that low levels drive the regulations. In fact, when that was first coming out with PFAS, a lot of the challenges were just getting analytical methodology to be able to report at that level accurately with enough quality assurance and quality control. So a couple things to be aware of. So why is this important for me if I'm not a water supplier? This is the key. Once MCLs are in effect for water quality, what generally happens next is you get a trickle-down effect of regulations. For example, if you are in a city that has a sewer treatment facility or a municipal water treatment plant, they basically have to meet certain regulations as well. So what they do is they pass them down. So if you have a discharge from your facility for wastewater, stormwater, the MCLs ultimately are going to drive the standards for those programs. So what I see coming down over the next couple of years is you're going to see more and more regulations where your discharge permit is going to have a PFAS concentration in it. So what's the trickle down of that? It's always kind of what's next. Well, if you have a PFAS limitation, you're going to have to meet that. And we've already talked about the difficulties in treating for PFAS. So essentially, it's going to really increase your potential operating costs. The other thing that's going to have a big impact is remediation programs. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when I talk about the circular designation for PFAS as a hazardous substance. But MCLs also drive groundwater quality even when it's not drinking water, because a lot of remediation action levels and cleanup standards are based to protect things for drinking water. So as a result, you're also going to see cleanup goals, action levels, and things like that for site remediation are going to likely now have PFAS as enforceable type levels. And that could, again, bring a lot more sites into remediation programs. And you can also bring sites which are already doing something that they may have to change to address PFAS. I think that's going to be a lesser impact because of some memos of understanding that have come out, but expect more changes because of the presence of MCLs. Last one I'm going to talk about in detail before shifting to another topic here is the circular hazardous substance regulations. So what does this really mean? By basically designating certain PFAS chemicals as a hazardous substance, it triggers mandatory release reporting notifications. The other thing it does, and this is where it really has a lot of potential future impact, it allows federal and state agencies with delegated circular, states with delegated circular authority to basically enforce cleanups, investigations, and things like that. So what it can do is this can impact the number of sites that will become listed as Superfund sites, which one's eligibility for brownfield programs, the scope of the cleanup under those programs. Now, this one is still evolving what the long-term impact is going to be, but the important thing to be aware of here is that the initial way that most regulators are looking at this, and not all, but the most common thing is they're looking at focusing on those who significantly contribute to the release of PFAS. So what that means is if you have an existing remedial program, let's say you're looking at chlorinated VOCs as your primary contaminant of concern. If PFAS show up, but it's a secondary concern where you don't have an obvious source of the PFAS, but it's showing up in your water, that is, at least what we're hearing, is that's going to be a lower regulatory priority. It doesn't mean it's going to be ignored, but they're not, so far, we haven't seen a really large push to focus on listing sites just because they have a little bit of PFAS, unless PFAS is the primary contaminant. So I think in the short term, what we're going to see is just changes in the way you monitor, the way you investigate to include PFAS, so that you get a better understanding of, once again, developing that database of just how prevalent is it, where are we seeing it. But over time, I think you will see more and more sites that where the PFAS could be a driver for listing and inclusion in remediation programs. So a couple things, we talked about the main things here. The other things, just some offshoots of this. CERCLA also sometimes drives DOT regulations. So keep in mind what you might see here too, different transporter requirements for materials that contain PFAS, which in turn that could increase your cost of disposal and your routine projects. So there's things out there that impact your operation that may not directly be obvious, but they can really impact your business. So on that point, what I'm going to do next is we're going to add a poll question. And this next poll question is basically going to focus on, from what I just described and your own knowledge of PFAS regulations, where do you see these most likely impacting your business? So let's let everyone answer this one a little bit, and then we can talk about it, because I think this is a really important one, which is going to tie into our next topic about risk management and prioritization related to PFAS. Okay, let's give this about 1 minute here, because I do think this is an important question for everyone to kind of understand where their organization should be focusing. Okay, it looks like we've got a pretty good representative group, and it also stabilized a little bit. So let's send these results out. Okay, interesting. This is kind of what I expected to see. And I think it's consistent with most of us are too busy to worry about what's coming in a year from now, and we're worried about what's due right now. And what is due and what is hot right now are the reporting programs. So I'm not surprised to see that being the priority for everybody. And I can just tell you, in consulting, we're seeing the same thing. The immediate focus for most organizations is the TSCA TRI type reporting obligations. And I agree that should probably be the short-term focus. And it's really interesting to me to see the other three kind of equally spread out there. And I think that also makes sense, because those are the ones where we really don't know the long-term impacts of those new regulations on business yet. So I really think the poll does a great job of showing pretty good snapshot of how the industry thinks. Okay. Last topic we're going to talk about today, and it looks like time we're doing okay here. Next topic is going to be risk mitigation strategy. So we went through all the PFAS stuff on regulations and what the issues are. Next question is, what do we do about it? And typical quote you hear often is, first step in solving any problem, you got to recognize there is one. So a lot of companies are still struggling with just knowing, do I have a PFAS problem or not? So what we're going to present here is a risk management strategy that will help you determine if you have a PFAS issue and to what extent that PFAS issue may impact your organization, and then some strategy on how best to manage it. So the strategy that we're advocating here is really applicable to any risk situation. So what we've done is we've taken standard risk management techniques and have applied them specifically to the PFAS issue. So definitely the way the steps work: identify, prioritize, implement corrective measures, and track effectiveness. So that model applies to any good risk management program. So when we talk about identifying PFAS in your organization, this gets back to that little quote I put. You got to understand, do you have a problem or not? If you can go through and realize you don't have PFAS, well, guess what? You're in great shape, and a lot of the rest of this doesn't apply. But what we've seen, and I think most organizations will see, you definitely have PFAS in your organization. The key is just how big of an issue is it? So I think at that point, with that in mind, you really shift more towards the second box. kind of prioritizing PFAS risks, because you may go through and realize, yes, we've identified the things, but realistically, probably not going to impact my business. And you might make the decision that we're not going to spend any money on it. We're just going to move on. And in some businesses, that's probably the right decision. Other businesses, it may fundamentally change the way you do work. Like, for example, I know in some cases, like the semiconductor industry, the etching process in fabrication uses PFAS-based surfactants. And while there have been some replacement products, they're just not showing up to be as effective as the current processes. That could actually impact so many things we do. Think about if the semiconductor process has to change their chemistry, the long-reaching impacts of that. And they're not alone. There's other things. You can have seals in medical devices. There's all kinds of implications. So each industry and each business is going to have very different priorities. So let's go to the next slide here. Okay, so first step first, and this one, in my opinion, is probably the most important thing out of this entire webinar. First thing most organizations need to do is they need to undertake a PFAS baseline assessment. I think it's probably less than 5% of the companies actually understand where PFAS is in their organization. So you need to do this, I think, before you can even evaluate if these other things apply to you and how you prioritize. So for the baseline assessment, a couple things you need to do. You need to understand your processes. You need to review your inventory procedures and your documents. How good is your inventory? Does it need to be updated? Do you have the information you need? You also have to work with your suppliers, because basically in a lot of cases, PFAS are coming into your organization and you won't even know how it got there. So the way to figure that out is to work carefully with your supply chain vendors and understand how it's getting to their organization, and then from there, how it gets into yours. Once that is all done, you'll have a much better handle on your baseline, and that will lead to the most efficient way to handle everything else. The one nice benefit of going through this baseline assessment, this is not necessarily wasted work. This work has to be done to do the TRI reporting and some of the TSCA reporting. So if you are in a category that has to report, you've got to do this anyway. It's not really an optional issue. It's something that's core to the reporting obligations. So once you've kind of come up with that baseline, next thing you have to do is you've got to prioritize your PFAS risks. And the way to look at prioritization, and this is something that's an important step that a lot of people overlook. A lot of people limit this to a qualitative evaluation without quantifying the risk. And that can often lead to erroneous results in priorities. Because to accurately prioritize a risk, you need two things. You need the magnitude of that risk, and the important one people also overlook is what is the probability of that risk occurring. So what you have to do here is each business scenario or transaction needs to be looked at differently so you understand what is the magnitude of that risk and what is the probability. One extreme example would be a lot of times regulations have fines of $25,000 per day per occurrence. In reality, it's very rare things ever get to the point where those fines are issued. So while it could add up to millions of dollars, it might be less than a 1% probability. So that would have to be factored into your risk prioritization. Conversely, you might have things like your inventory reporting system just can't even allow you to comply. That could lead to significant risk. Or it could be that you've got a supply chain vendor whose product that's critical to your operation is loaded with PFAS, and you're going to have to deal with it. That's core critical. That's not an environmental issue. That's a business issue. And that would obviously have to have a lot higher priorities, because then you have to look at loss of revenue, quality control of your products. And putting a dollar value on that can really skew your risk prioritization. Some common corrective measures we talked about. I think due diligence is an important thing too. Now that it's a hazardous substance under CERCLA, anytime you're doing property transactions, ASTM phase 1, phase 2s, you don't have to consider PFAS. A lot of companies have not really been doing that, but with these MCLs and the hazardous substance regulations, PFAS now has to get incorporated into good due diligence. So that's going to impact both your cost of due diligence as well as the ramifications of the findings. Because what happens if you go out and you find that PFAS is present in the groundwater or soil on a site? That risk prioritization piece really becomes important, to determine what corrective measures, whether it's going to be handled as part of the business deal, money put it inside an escrow, things like that. It can drive the entire transaction process. And the last step I'm going to talk about here is program tracking. Any good risk management program, you have to see the effectiveness of what you're trying to do. And a lot of people put these programs in without understanding how to really track, is it working or not? So what we're advocating is think about the tracking program throughout your process so that you're accurately getting good information on how effective these initiatives are. The other thing that's important with tracking is one size doesn't fit all. You've got different stakeholders. Your person in your C-suite is going to have a very different concern than a person on a factory floor who's running the water treatment plant. So your tracking program needs to be able to handle all those different tiers of stakeholders for it to be effective. And our last slide we're going to have here before we go to some questions, I'm going to add one more poll. And this poll question is really gauged towards kind of where you are in your PFAS program. So what I'd like is for the people here in the audience to take a look and get a feel for how prepared you think your personal organization is to deal with some of the issues we've talked about today. Timing-wise, it looks like we're doing good still to have at least 10 minutes for questions, so we can let this poll run a second. As we're letting some of the results come in, just a couple of ground rules for questions that I think will be helpful as we go to the next step. There's not going to be enough time here to get into a lot of specific questions about something in your organization or that's very detailed, but we would like to try to talk more about those big picture type questions and strategies, things like that. So if we don't immediately answer your questions, because we do have a lot of questions I see coming in, we will basically try to hit upon answers to general things that may help give you guidance for some of your specific cases. Okay, let's just give this another 10 seconds here and then we'll take a look. Okay, looking at the results here. Interesting. I think what's really good is that only 11% here have said they're already effectively managing PFAS. And that's not surprising given that this is a new thing for everybody. Everyone is still learning. To me, I'm a little surprised at that the max that they've initiated some but have a lot of work ahead. I thought there would be a few more, honestly, that hadn't even started looking at it yet. So what the poll does show, though, clearly is that most organizations, we're kind of on step 1 of 100 here when it comes to PFAS. And now that these regulations have defined timelines, more regulations are coming. I think PFAS in general needs to be elevated a little bit in your corporation's mindset and risk management programs. Okay. All right. So at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to stop and look to take some questions from the audience, and we can go from there. I probably will not be able to answer all questions, just given the broad topic we talked about today. But what I do is I will do my best to find out any answers for anyone who would like to follow up individually with me. I did put my email on here so if you do have some questions that are more specific to your situation, please feel free to reach out via email. I also did want to quickly, before going to questions, thank EHS Today for their sponsorship of this program and the great content that they provide to their members and the community.
Oh, thank you, Daniel. You've just made my day. And thank you for that great presentation. Several of you have already submitted questions, but before we jump right in, we ask that you take a moment to complete the feedback form that will appear on your screen at the end of the webinar. Okay, we have what would you be your recommendations if the sorry, I'm not good at pronouncing acronyms. The TSCA reporting applies to a company, but they do not have the records available going back to 2011. How would that company proceed?
That's a great question, and probably the most common one we're asked related to the TSCA reporting. So I think it's a good question to talk about. The reality is very few organizations are going to have the records. So the key phrase you need to be aware of is there's a term called to the extent reasonably ascertainable. So what you have to do is you would have to make a good faith effort to acquire the information that you need for reporting. And the reality is that in some cases, you're going to get it. In some cases, you're not. And what we have done with our customers is we will actually involve their internal risk management team to talk about how much is reasonably ascertainable. I can tell you our strategy that we advocate would be we consider it reasonable if you go through your own existing inventory records, look at sometimes in some cases purchasing records. So that will cover your internal manufactured products. And then on the import side, we consider it reasonable if you send a questionnaire to your clients, your suppliers, asking whether the products that they've provided to you contain PFAS or not. And if so, what compositions in the form of an SDS or other information. Now, at that, once you do that, it's very likely they're not going to basically have all the information you still need. Then at that point, you want to document what you've done and maybe make one other follow-up outreach. And then at that point, what we're advocating is that you document everything. And at that point, you document the information as reasonably not ascertainable. And then you report with the information you have. And I am not a lawyer here. I definitely recommend you speak to your in-house counsel and risk management teams on that, because every company has a very different posture on risk management. Good question, though.
Yes, we have lots of good questions. So next up, someone writes, we have PFAS coming into our plant from incoming water, etc. How are these to be reported for TRI? They give an example that PFAS is in the river water we use for non-contact once through cooling.
It's a good question. To be honest, I don't know specifically that scenario if it would be subject to reporting, but once it comes into your process, and the reason I hesitate is because of the term non-contact cooling. If you had any contact with it whatsoever, I think the bottom line is once it comes in, it's yours. You would have to be responsible for managing just like you would any other type of process. I think even with non-contact cooling, where you would still have some of those same obligations, but I think the thing you'd have to look at is was it manufactured, processed, or does it meet that definition of otherwise used? And without knowing your specifics of your processes, I couldn't really answer that. But I think that you'd have to go through, though, looking at it from the point of view is, does it meet the definitions of manufactured, process, or otherwise used? That would be my first recommendation. And then see if there's a way to exempt it from not meeting one of those definitions. If in turn it does meet that definition after looking at your processes, then you probably would have to go through the process of considering reporting it, as long as it's above thresholds and so on.
All right, great. Next question, when will it hit the RCRA regulations?
Yeah, I had that on one of my slides, but I didn't talk about it. They are currently right now looking at the RCRA regulations. Let me see if I can find my notes on that. Give me 1 second here. Yeah, right now they actually have some proposed RCRA regulations to add 9 different PFAS to the RCRA list of hazardous constituents. I don't know the timing on that, but I would expect it sooner rather than later, just because it's they're already working on proposed regulations. So they're kind of beyond that initial study piece of it and getting into the details of regulation writing. So I do think you will find PFAS covered under RCRA relatively soon. I would not be shocked if it's within the next year.
Okay. Next question. Someone wants to know, where would I find a baseline assessment?
Baseline assessment, I mean, you don't really find one. Essentially, what you do is you work with a consultant firm who can work with you and your team. And essentially, most good consulting firms would have staff that can help you with that. Anyone who's done TRI reporting, things like that, this is a kind of a common thing to go in and do a baseline survey. It's also done, other companies that have done investigations for transactions, they do baseline assessments. So I think the reality is you would want to partner with a consulting firm that understands what you're trying to achieve, and then they will work together with you to define what the scope of that baseline assessment would be.
Next question. Can I use a product's SDS to determine if I have PFAS? If so, what section should I look in and what chemical terms should I look for? Or will the SDS actually include the term PFAS?
Great question. The reality is it probably will not necessarily contain the term PFAS. So let's kind of take the question one piece at a time. Can you use an SDS to determine if PFAS is in your products or things like that? I guess the answer is maybe. And the reason I say that is because if it has a CAS number and it is a hazardous substance, they would put it on a SDS. However, up until recently, they might not have had to report it depending upon what the triggers were. The other thing too is that in a lot of cases, it's at such a low concentration that many manufacturers and things would consider that a de minimis level. And then the third factor is in some cases, you're going to have confidentiality information where they're not necessarily going to disclose it. And then you factor in that you may have 10,000 plus specific chemicals. You need to basically be able to cross-reference those SDSs against the chemical list. So I think the answer is maybe. And even when you do it, there might be a lot of data manipulation that you have to do to get it to the point where it's reportable. And I know that's something that our company's been working on, and there are different tools we use to try to make that as efficient as possible. But at the end of the day, it's just a lot of work that has to be done both at the company and by the consulting firm.
Okay. Next question. Gosh, there's so many to choose from, so many good ones. Are the analytical methods for PFAS adequate to detect PPT concentrations accurately? Are there a large enough number of laboratories capable of proving, or I think they mean providing, these analyses?
Yeah, the answer to your question is yes, they can get down to PPT level with acceptable quality control procedures. Matter of fact, I was just about 2 weeks ago at a presentation given by an analytical lab that I thought was outstanding on some of the changes in the methodologies and how they go about quantifying things. So the answer to your question is yes, they can do it. It also is a very fast evolving field right now. They're constantly coming out with different methodologies for how they report, how they quantify. So there are labs out there that can do it. I think what you need to do though is just research the specific laboratories, look for their accreditation and so on. But short answer is yes, there are labs that can get to that part per trillion reporting level.
Great. I'm curious as to whether you think PFAS regulations will change depending on who is in the White House or which party holds the majority in Congress.
If I knew the answer to that, I probably would not be giving this webinar right now. And I'd be a very happy, wealthy person. The reality is, without getting political, that certain people tend to be more business friendly than other people. And as a result, I do see there will probably be some impact, but I do not think they're going away. I think the impact, if anything, is going to be more maybe having some more exemptions, things like that, to kind of make it more manageable. But I don't think it's going away. The other thing that I think will have even a bigger impact potentially than who's in the White House is, for those of you who've been following what they call the Chevron deference, that ruling I think could have a potentially even bigger impact, because there used to be a presumption that the regulators had better knowledge to interpret what the regulations mean and how they apply. And there has recently been a court ruling that kind of weakened that position a little bit, so that other experts now can opine on what's applicable, what the regulations really mean, and how they need to be applied. So I think that, to be honest, I think will have a much bigger impact on the direction PFAS regs go, because I think there's going to be some challenges, and it's not going to be just the default where it defaults back to what the regulators think.
Okay, thank you for sharing. We'll go ahead and ask 2 more questions. I know we're coming close to the top of our hour, but as I did say, we have a lot of really good questions and want to help as many folks as possible navigate this. So how do we go about reporting data if our purchase records do not go back to 2011? Our company has a 5 to 6 year records retention policy.
I think that's kind of similar to the question I asked before. I think the reality is you need to show enough due diligence that you've made an effort. And I think if you can show that all records have been destroyed for those years, you can probably, as long as that's consistent with your legal obligations to hold on to records, you can probably make a reasonable case that that data wouldn't be reasonably ascertainable. But again,
Okay.
I do think you should be speaking to counsel on questions like that because it really is part of your corporate risk management program.
Okay, great. And of the regulatory programs discussed, which ones do you see having the biggest short-term impact on my business? And what about the long-term impacts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think on the short term, I think the poll really nailed it pretty accurately. The short term is absolutely going to be these reporting obligations. The reporting obligations, they have real firm deadlines. They're ongoing right now. And there's a lot of work that gets involved. And I think the cost, most companies are going to be very shocked at how expensive it is to comply with some of those reporting obligations for PFAS. So I think short term is definitely the reporting, the TSCA, TRI type reporting. Long term, I feel it's going to be the MCL driven regs that are going to ultimately have the biggest impact because I mentioned it early in the presentation, there's kind of a trickle down effect of MCLs. Once you establish that drinking water quality level, that goes to a groundwater quality level. That in turn goes to cleanup levels and action levels. That in turn goes to discharge criteria. So I think that one is big because it's going to affect day-to-day operations more than just kind of a one-off report once a year type of thing. Circular has a similar type of thing, but I think the MCL ones just have a little potentially further reaching impacts because of its day-to-day operations as opposed to just cleanup type obligations.
Okay, great. Thank you, Daniel, for a fantastic presentation. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, BSI Group, for making this possible. And I would like to thank all of you attendees for your active participation. On behalf of EHS Today, stay safe, take care, everyone.
Okay, thank you.